not only is he stepping into this GHG quantification role as Juan Sotias is leaving just 5 months into his job. So thanks for that, stepping right in. Also, he's a person I think we might all be getting to know as we think about the data that we're collecting in future from our projects and how we can manage it to optimize its use for all of us. So a great resource for you. And I'll just pass it over to you, Akash, to guide us through today.
Great, thanks, Mary, and good afternoon, everyone. So I've talked with a few of you over the past few weeks, and I've gotten to know some of you, and I'm sure I'll get to know many more of you in the coming weeks and months. I'm just going to go ahead and share my screen and hopefully get started. Just give me 1 second. All right.
Yep, you're good, Akash. Yeah,
awesome.
And just sorry, I forgot to mention to everyone that we'll be recording the session because I know there's a few of you who could not make it today. So we're just recording the session so we can share with everyone after as well.
Awesome, thanks, Oscar. Great. So yeah, as Mary mentioned, I've been with TAF for a few months and have essentially we're it's unfortunate that Miriam couldn't be here today because she was really excited to be here and help walk through some of the work that she's done over the last number of years at TAF. But TAF has been doing this for a while now. So we've been doing quantification related to both our grant intake process as well as evaluating policies, impact, investment opportunities, et cetera. And what we're hoping to do here today is share our experience and share what we've sort of learned over the last decade or so, but also use this knowledge as a basis for future collaboration. This is only 90 minutes, so I don't expect we're going to be able to solve or answer all the questions that everyone here at this on this call have today. But what I'm hoping for is we can at least deliver some foundational knowledge or some sort of foundational methodology and some applied experience that we can then use to inform future discussions. So, and also, I mean, it's important to know that I don't want to spend the entire time talking here. I'm hoping to have enough time to really dive into some questions. If there are any questions that I can't personally answer and that Mariam would have been better suited to discuss, we'll take those questions down and hopefully circulate some sort of question and answer document in the coming days or weeks. So with that, I'll dive in. Our agenda is fairly extensive, but what I'm hoping to do, instead of sort of taking questions on the fly or leaving it all to the end, what I'll do is I'll stop for questions every 5 or 6 slides. So if you do have anything that comes up while I'm talking or going through these slides, please just drop it in the chat. And then at those breaks, I'll try to answer them, or I'll try to answer as many as possible so that we're not just losing that thought until the end. So we're going to start off with just going over why we're doing quantification in the first place, diving into the purpose of the exercise and what it sort of drives for us, both at TAF as well as the intended purpose at Lc3. I'll talk a little bit about what our experience at TAF has been and sort of what we've managed to accomplish over the last decade plus. I'll touch really briefly on the Lc3 methodology and also go over some common definitions. But what I'm really hoping to spend the majority of time on is walking through the process of actually modeling those Ghg reductions, along with some case studies. And near the end, I'll also hopefully propose some next steps that we can use to have a bit of discussion on how we want to sort of learn together and collaborate moving forward. So why is quantification important? Well, at TAF, we generally do quantification for one of 2 reasons. Either it is to inform our evaluation of potential grants and or investment opportunities, or it is to try to quantify the impact that a specific policy might have. We do have a policy team in-house, And for those potential initiatives that come across our plate, we at times do some back of the envelope calculations to figure out, okay, is this really going to drive some significant reductions moving forward? But there are a number of sort of secondary benefits or initiatives. There's a whole sort of ecosystem of things that this quantification helps drive. And I wanted to not lose sight of that, given that we're going to be diving in pretty deeply later on into the actual process itself. So for example, we have a number of KPIs and reporting processes that a lot of our quantification work helps drive. Quantification also gives us some credibility in terms of being able to back up our investments with actual numbers, being able to say, look, we went and had to make this decision because we believe that there's high potential, and here's the process we use to follow and make that decision. And I've also heard this saying a number of times by a number of people at TAF, but we like to follow the carbon. We like to make sure that whatever funds we're deploying, we're actually doing so while keeping in mind that our sort of high-level goal here is to mitigate carbon emissions. And so this quantification effort in large part is due to our or is driven by our need to really reduce carbon at scale. So yes, it's really tied into these grants, investment evaluation, and policy analysis processes, but it has broader implications. Now, I think this is a question that's come up quite a bit. How is quantification at TAF at LC3 different? What are we proposing here that's different than what are sort of more traditional quantification processes that are specified by standards like the GHG protocol? And this is a question that I also initially struggled with as well, and I think it's useful to talk a bit about this. So I think generally people on the outside typically think of GHG quantification in terms of either inventories or accounting related to projects. And when we're doing project accounting, what we're trying to do is we're actually trying to estimate the actual reductions that are related to that specific project or program being assessed. And the reason for doing so is in part, well, there's a number of reasons. In some cases, we're trying to justify the creation of offset credits that would be used in lieu of reductions by another entity. They would buy credits on the market. In other instances, we're trying to figure out, okay, if we invest in this initiative, how much of an impact will it have on our business? How many emissions can we then claim to reduce in terms of our organizational scope? In terms of what we're trying to do here at TAF at LC3, it's a bit different than that. We're not just looking at the emissions related to that project. We're trying to figure out whether or not that project can be a catalyst for some sort of carbon reduction pathway. And as a result, we're not just assessing the carbon reductions associated with that project, but with the pathway itself. And that gets, well, number one, it's a bit harder to do. There's a lot more ambiguity, a lot more uncertainty with that sort of estimate. We're not just looking at this finite boundary. We're trying to predict the future in some ways and figure out, okay, like if everything goes right, if this project is truly a catalyst for this pathway being realized, what does that look like at scale? What are the reductions we might see at scale? And so, yes, there's a lot more uncertainty associated with that, but also in some ways it lowers the bar for accuracy. And I'll touch on this in a second, but we're not creating credits. We're not trying to do this to justify a project or to create a financial instrument that others can use. What we're trying to do is we're using this quantification as a screening tool. We're trying to justify that, you know, the potential path here is large enough that it's worth investing in. So again, just to reiterate, this is a decision-making tool first and foremost. And our job as funders, one could argue, is to really spend our money where the biggest pieces of the pie are. So again, we're not we're really trying to figure out, okay, what are the potential actions or pathways available to us? Does this project support that pathway? And if so, how large is that pathway? And so I'll touch on this in a second, but those are two very different things. And this ties directly into the difference between direct and potential emissions reductions. I'm not going to touch too much on the direct emissions piece, just to say that typically project accounting focuses on that we're really trying to figure out the impact directly attributable to that project. And again, potential emissions are the impact created by that pathway for which this project or initiative serves as a catalyst. And those two things are not necessarily correlated. So you might have this amazing project or initiative that can directly create 10 megatons of carbon reductions for that specific initiative. But if it's a one-off, if it's not something that could be applied elsewhere, if it's something that's very unique to the geography of the area that's being implemented or the actors at play, those direct emissions will not scale. And so those two things are not always related, and in many cases they could be quite different. So I'll just go over quantification at TAF really quickly, and then I'll pause for questions in a couple of slides. So at TAF, we've been doing this for over a decade. We've approved over 100 projects with quantification assessments attached to them. We don't actually. Sorry, I should mention that we do move forward with quantification assessments for projects that we don't approve, of course, as well. But as you'll see in a slide, in a couple of slides, there is a pretty big disconnect between the ones we do quantify and the ones that we deem as not quantifiable in terms of the ones that make it to the screening stage and the ones that get approved for funding. And I'll touch on that in a few slides. This is all to say that while we've developed some experience and we've done this for quite a while, we're by no means done learning here. We have developed some tools and we've developed some expertise that we believe can be leveraged by the other centers here, but we're hoping to draw from everyone else's experiences here as well, and we're still learning. So quite often what we do internally is we rely on past work that's been done in that specific sector on a specific project and iterate on that project and improve on it as time goes on. But we're constantly throwing around new ideas. We're looking for new research. We're looking for new data sources. We're also continuing to improve our methodology as well. And this is not something that'll ever stop. So while we've done quite a bit of work in this field, we're still learning. And it's also important to note that the first few projects are always the hardest. We have established a pretty substantial database of past assessments that we now rely on to do future assessments. And so our time invested per project has decreased over time. We roughly can allocate most projects into 1 or 9 or 10 buckets. And if it is in one of those 9 or 10 buckets, we generally have a few projects we can rely on. Yeah, I'll stop there. Does anyone have any questions? I can't see the chat.
There are no questions in the chat so far, but happy to just open it and check if there's any questions. Mike, yes, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, I'm hoping you can share a spreadsheet for each one of those 9 or 10 buckets you're talking about. That would be incredibly helpful, I think, for everybody to have that, because I know I've got a couple from Miriam in the past, but one's for electric vehicles, and I think the other one is for building retrofits. So if you've got like all of those that you could make in a and a resource library for the rest of us, that would be greatly appreciated.
Yeah, we've done some work to start to put together that sort of database, I think, based on some feedback from others in the room. I don't know the exact timing as to when that might be available, but it is something we're working on, and I don't think there's any reason we couldn't share it. So yeah, yeah, thanks for that. We will. I can probably say pretty safely that that's something that we'll be distributing at some point in the coming months.
I don't see any other hands or questions in the chat, so.
Okay. I'll move on. Okay, so the Lc3 methodology. I'm going to quickly run through this because I believe most people in the room are familiar with this, but I'll just say that the methodology is something that's existed for, I believe, over a year now. It was initially developed by in collaboration with TAF, but by an external committee. And the intent here is to continue to iterate on it. So I think it's a great document, a great framework that is serving as a starting point. And the intent here is to gain some practical experience collectively. And you know, if there are learnings that we gain or things that we need to improve, we can certainly revisit this document and add or edit or revise as needed. And just to say that there are a number of components of this methodology that are pulled from established standards. And so this isn't something that we came up with from scratch. Part of it was informed by some of TAF's work in the past, but I believe, and my understanding is that there was an external committee that put this together and that it heavily drew from existing standards to help inform what actually finally ended up in the document that now everyone relies on to do their work. This is also, I mean, this is part of the intent of this workshop. This is a methodology, a framework for sort of best practices or how we intend to do quantification as part of the Lc3 group. But this is a starting point, and the intent here is, you know, we take this and then we develop implementation tools, or we figure out how to quantify different projects so that those are reflected, the methodologies that are reflected in this document can actually have some sort of practical templates is the wrong word, but we have some models to follow that we can then use to establish some sort of consistency across the board. Because this is a great starting point, but it doesn't necessarily tell you exactly what steps you need to follow in order to get that from this document into some sort of a quantification or some sort of a final number that you can then use to justify your investments. There are a number of principles here. I'm not going to go over these. I'll just point out that the last one, practical, does speak to the level of rigor, reflecting a reasonable level of effort. And I mean, I think that's a key one to point out, just because the intent here isn't to create overly complex models. We're trying to use this as a screening tool to figure out whether or not there's enough of enough potential here in terms of carbon reductions to justify the investment. And so if we can get that answer, if we can get a good enough answer using a simpler approach or simple model, that is what we're going to do. I think, especially given that we're looking at potential at scale, there's so much uncertainty with those sort of assessments that you know, building really complex models, building things that are overly specified, creates additional work without actually getting at that actual question, which is, you know, is this investment justified given what we know about the scope of the project. So I think that's something that should always be kept in mind here, that really the intent of the methodology is to be reflective of the resources that are available to each of the individual centers, but also that if you're making a reasonable level of effort to really get at that question, is there a scale pathway here for this project, and what does that look like in terms of carbon reductions? I don't think the intent here is to create overly complex models to answer that question. I'm going to go over some definitions just to make sure everyone's on the same playing field. This is here for reference and sort of paraphrased from the methodology itself. But yeah, I'll pause at the end of these definitions just in case anyone has questions. But I'm aware that many in this room this might be repetitive, but I think it's a good idea just to go over them, just to make sure everyone is starting from the same place. So emissions factors. So these are sort of the first two here are foundational pieces for doing GHG quantification. Emissions factors are generally how we take activity data, so things like the amount of gasoline consumed, the amount of electricity used, and convert that to greenhouse gas emissions. So generally, these are things that are widely established. We have an appendix in the Lc3 methodology, which is sourced from the National Inventory Report and a couple of other sources as well. And these are things that are foundational to doing GHG quantification work. Closely related to that is the global warming potential or global warming potential factors. And the intent of using these factors is really to make sure that we can easily communicate the impact of specific projects. We can do so on a level playing field, because trying to communicate or compare different cities in terms of their greenhouse gas emissions by looking at the individual gases, looking at carbon dioxide versus methane versus nitrous oxide, it becomes really hard to assess those trade-offs. And so as a result, what we do is we convert all of those gases in terms of what would be the equivalent carbon dioxide emitted if we were to look at a common unit. And these are typically measured on two different timescales. Most applications I've seen, especially most GHG inventories, look at the 100-year timescale. So that essentially means, for example, if you were looking at methane, how much would be the warming effect, or what would be the warming effect of methane over that 100-year timescale versus that of carbon dioxide? And that could be very different measured on a 100-year timescale versus that on a 20-year timescale, partly because gases like methane live in the atmosphere on a much shorter time basis. And this is actually something that we want to bring up as a future discussion point, because something we're doing at TAF is really trying to figure out whether we can move more to a 20-year timescale for certain projects, as opposed to the 100-year timescale that we use for inventory. But I'll leave that there for now and maybe get back to it later. So as I mentioned, we use those global warming potential factors to convert various gases into their carbon dioxide equivalent, and then we sum that all up to get the total carbon emissions associated with an initiative, with a specific city's inventory, a country's inventory, all on a common unit. So generally, when you look at any reported value of carbon reductions or carbon emissions, they're expressed in terms of carbon dioxide equivalents. Marginal emissions factor. So this is typically something we at TAF only use with electricity demand. The idea here is that if you're consuming electricity and it's coming from a grid, you can't generally rely on what we call the average emissions factor would be for the resources that make up the electricity grid. If your grid is made up of 90% nuclear, which we assume is zero emitting, and 10% natural gas, if you are going to consume more electricity, that's typically going to result in more natural gas. The nuclear resource will not go up or down. And so as a result, we tend to rely on what we call marginal emissions factors. So figuring out what that resource is on the margin and using the emissions factor associated with that marginal resource to figure out whether or not those reductions are higher or lower than they would otherwise would be. And I should mention that can have both a positive and a negative impact on any sort of assessment. So if you're looking at energy efficiency projects, using marginal emissions factors as opposed to the average emissions factors typically has a positive impact on the assessment, because generally your marginal emissions factors are higher than your average emissions factors. But if you're looking at things like fuel switching from natural gas to electricity, that could have a negative impact on that assessment. But generally, we believe that marginal emissions factors are the more accurate way to do this assessment. And this is actually a relatively complex thing to come up with, and probably something that we could dive into in a separate on a separate workshop. Another topic that we could also probably do an entire workshop on is the carbon net present value. This is something that we've borrowed from the financial space. So if any of you have done or worked in financial analysis or financial modeling, the basic idea here is that $1 today is worth more than $1 tomorrow. So translating this to our sort of context, a carbon or a reduction of a ton of carbon emissions now is worth more than one in the future. And so what we typically do is we will heavily discount carbon reductions that are made well into the future to reflect the importance of near-term action. And this can be for a number of reasons, partly because we have more certainty in the near term in terms of policy, in terms of those reductions actually being real. We also know that there's more of an imperative to have those reductions happen now, because at some point we're going to hit sort of these positive feedback loops, and at some point there will be no return. And so there is an imperative to prioritize those carbon reductions sooner rather than later, and carbon net present value is our way of doing so. Okay, so we're about to get into the bulk of the presentation. Maybe I'll pause there. Does anyone have any questions about anything I just covered? I know it was at very high level, but yeah.
Yeah, thanks, Akash. I was curious what discount rate you use for the carbon net present value.
We're currently using 5%.
Okay.
I believe that a couple of other organizations might be using something a bit different. This is actually something that we're hoping to discuss in an upcoming workshop or call. Just what should that discount rate be? We've been using 5% for a number of years, but I would say that it's not really based on any sort of robust financial basis. It's something we've generally assumed would be a reasonable rate, but it's not based on anything.
Cool. Yeah, thank you. I realize it's not necessarily tied to anything. It's just whatever you decide, like how much more do you want to value those near-term reductions? Cool. Thank you.
So I have a question just on decision making. Yeah, and that the discount rate is really good and really important because it does change things quite a bit, just like it does in financial analysis. So having some justification for it in the future will be something good to do. I have a question just about decision making though. So we did set our hurdle rate here, and we've been doing it. We sort of do the net present value version, and is that the one that TAF relies on in terms of reaching your hurdles, or do you use the undiscounted one?
We currently use the discounted rate, the carbon net present value, but of course, what that hurdle rate or what that amount is driven by both your discount rate and to answer your question, I think if I memory serves me correctly, we would have had that that anchor amount be something higher prior to implementing carbon net present value. And all that is trying to do is, if we're looking at two projects that have the same cumulative 20-year emissions reductions, the ones that prioritize near-term action will be rated more highly. And so I believe that hurdle rate, if you are moving from something that's just cumulative to something that's using carbon net present value, that hurdle rate should be lowered as well. I'm not sure if that was the question you were getting at, but
that is because the hurdle even that like Juan and Miriam has helped us create based on sort of TAF's experience, and we apportioned it to our markets, is still really tough, undiscounted. For us to, we have only a few projects that kind of meet it, that are making it. So I don't know. So I'm just wondering how TAF is treating that. So maybe we could further reduce our hurdle, but anyway, I think time will tell. Of course, we have to be flexible, I think, in early days. So
yeah, and I can get back to you on the. I mean, I know that there was some work done by both Juan and Marianne, I believe late last year, to kind of do that comparison across jurisdictions. I can take that back with me and get you some more information. I believe that we do set for the grant intake process, the number we use is 2 million, but of course the population of the GTHA is larger than many other jurisdictions, but I don't remember exactly how that translated to the other jurisdictions when we did that analysis.
Yeah, we set ours at 250 based on the apportionment that Miriam and Juan did. But again, I find that in the addressable market here, that's very challenging, particularly on the investment side when you're looking at commercialization and scale up. I just think that's very, very challenging. Certainly if you're doing a policy reform or something, you might be able to trigger that. But yeah, so I don't know. Anyway, I think it's one of those things that we'll have to have conversations over the next few years, because we'll have to see if that's a reasonable hurdle for us or not. But.
Also, I was just going to pipe up here, and I put this in the chat, that at TAF our targets for lending are lower than they are for granting. So again, just to kind of responding to what you're saying, Mike, in terms of what seems to be feasible, I think it's a really important discussion to have. Like, is the problem that, anyway, I won't go down this road too far, but if we can't get the hurdle rates that we think are needed to drive projects that are going to hit the targets ultimately, then maybe we have to have a rethink. Like, what are we doing? And do we need to work hard to build those projects if they don't exist already? And in fact, I think that's something that TAF has had to grapple with. We had a lot of low impact projects earlier, the ones that were just coming to us. And then we had to take some steps to try and more proactively cultivate the higher rate ones. But that's maybe another kind of a discussion too.
I believe there's a question from Ted and then Mark.
Yeah, just a question, Akash, for the discussion about scaling up. It sounds like an expected income or probability kind of discussion. Are you going to get into that in the next section?
Yeah, so I'll both walk through our high-level modeling process, but I'll also be walking through a couple of case studies to show how we sort of assume or what sort of factors we use to come up to that scale-up number. I will say, to preface all of this, that it is a bit more art than science, that a lot of it is based on professional judgment and then try to figure out what's reasonable to assume. But yeah, I'll get into that process in a few slides.
Okay, thank you.
Hey, again, just curious if you apply the carbon net present value to all savings in the same way, like both direct project savings and scale up potential, or is it only applied to the potential savings?
I believe that when we do our initial assessment, it is applied to both.
Okay.
I cannot recall when we're doing our after the fact analysis whether that's applied or not. But
Okay.
I can probably clarify that with Miriam and get back to you.
Sure. Thanks.
Don't see any additional questions in the chat or hands raised, so I think you're good to go.
Awesome. Thanks, Oscar. Okay, modeling GHG reductions. So I'll start off here by just walking through the process that we follow, and this is largely tailored towards our grants and impact investing process. Just to give you a bit of context as to how we go about evaluating these potential initiatives to start, and then I'll walk us through the actual quantification piece itself. So first of all, when we get a project in the door, we start off with doing a bit of an initial assessment. We really try to understand what the project is trying to accomplish, what the scope of the proposed initiative is, and the really important question here, which I'll get into, is whether or not this is something we can actually quantify. Because there are a number of projects that, for whatever reason, are trying to quantify that initiative would be a bit like a fool's errand. So that's generally what we're trying to get at when we first look at a project: is what are they trying to accomplish here? What are they proposing here? And is this something that we can actually quantify right now? And then after that, we try to model the impact of that solution at scale. And that's sort of the bulk of this work, and then really the piece that we're going to dive into today. But there are a number of other things that happen after that, which I should mention actually before I dive in, that when we do that initial assessment and then we try to model the impact of that solution, it's not done in a vacuum. We're not sort of creating our spreadsheet model, signing off of it, and then sort of walking away from the process. We do that initial assessment and those initial calculations to get a sense of what this project is trying to accomplish. But we will obviously not have all the information at our fingertips to start. We also want to be able to have discussions with potential applicants to see if there's something we're missing, if there's something they can tweak about their application in order to position it for scaling in a certain sector. These are all things that we sort of have a back and forth with the applicant on in order to help refine that application, refine our own evaluation, and in order to get as accurate of an idea of what this project is trying to accomplish as possible. And then that leads into sort of the scoring of that application at the end. What I'm really going to focus on here today, though, is really just those first two pieces. How do we make that initial assessment? And then how do we actually model that impact at scale? The other three things are important to the process, but we're going to just leave that for another workshop or other discussions we'll have with all of you at some later point. So I really wish that this title was called something different, because I've realized after looking at the Lc3 methodology earlier today that there's something else also called process flow diagram in that document, which is depicting something a little bit different. But just to give you a sense of what this process looks like, we first get an application or a potential investment in the door, and we make that initial assessment. Okay, is this thing quantifiable or not? If it's not quantifiable, it doesn't mean that we walk away, that we're not still involved, but it does mean that we're likely not going to be building some sort of model in order to try to get at that quantification reduction, or to try to quantify that reduction potential. We do then proceed with some sort of preliminary analysis, trying to get a sense of is the potential here high, something that's significant or something that is fairly minuscule relative to our other projects that we're comparing it against. And then if it is high potential, and this is not all or nothing sort of assessment. In general, what we try to do is focus on the projects that are deemed to be high potential, but we can also, as I mentioned, work with the applicants, the proponents, the people that are proposing some sort of project for investment. But in general, what we do is we try to focus on the things that are deemed to be high potential, and we will then refine that assessment to come up with a final number. And then if in addition to our assessment, all the other things line up and the funding is approved for that project or investment, we will then record that project information in our own internal spreadsheet. And then something we've been working at or talking a bit more in recent months is focusing more on that ex post analysis, looking at whether those projects actually realized the reductions that we initially estimated at the onset of the project. There is this slide here, which goes into a lot more detail about what this process might look like. I am not going to walk through this, but it is here for your reference in case you're interested in some of the more nuanced details. So as I mentioned, the first thing we do whenever we get a project in the door is try to figure out, okay, is this project or initiative quantifiable? As you can imagine, that's not always an easy question to answer. We generally do try to look at some of our thought processes from past projects and rely on that to inform whether or not future projects that are coming in the door are quantifiable or not. But there's a lot of gray area. And really the question we're trying to answer here is this reasonable to quantify right now? There could be a number of reasons why something is deemed not to be quantifiable. And I'm not sure why there's a pie chart missing here, but the intent of the charts below was essentially to point out that for whatever reason, and I'm not going to pose it as to why, many more of our projects that get approved are quantifiable rather than unquantifiable, but at the screening phase, about 50% of them are quantifiable. And so there is some sort of bias towards projects in terms of our historical assessments. There is some sort of bias towards those projects that have been quantifiable in the past, and that could be due to a number of reasons. Oh, okay, that popped up. So in terms of why a project might be deemed unquantifiable, there are a few different reasons, but typically they fall into the bucket of either laying the groundwork for other sorts of initiatives, so things like tool development, or there's just not enough data at our fingertips in order to make an accurate assessment here. So to ground that in some concrete examples, a type of project that in the past we've assessed as being unquantifiable are things like HOV lanes, so high occupancy vehicle lanes, lanes that are reserved for both those that are carpooling as well as generally those that are driving green vehicles. There presumably is some sort of greenhouse gas reduction impact that is associated with the implementation of that sort of policy or initiative. But it's almost impossible for us, given the current data we have, to accurately nail that number down. And there's, I come from the transportation space. Even just estimating the impact on demand is a question that's hard for us to answer. Knowing what the knock-on effects are going to be in terms of adoption becomes even a harder question to answer. And so for those kinds of things where we don't think we can actually reasonably answer the question, what sort of quantifiable impact is that initiative going to have? We just deem it to be unquantifiable. We don't try to build a complex model where things just might have this really large range of uncertainty. There are also things that lay the groundwork, as I mentioned, things like tool development, jurisdictional scans, those sorts of projects that are important and are things that help lay the groundwork for other types of more practical initiatives or things that might drum up support for action. But these things do not try to quantify, probably because it's hard to really estimate those secondary and tertiary effects. That being said, for some of these projects, we will still try to do some back of the envelope quantitative assessment, and we will absolutely try to at least qualitatively assess whether or not there is a significant high potential pathway here. This might not be reflected in the scoring. This might not be reflected in some sort of final number, but we do try to at least critically think through, okay, we are not able to quantify this project at this time, but if we're trying to think through what this is trying to help support, are there actual impacts that we might be able to at least quantify in the future if more data were to be made available, or if there are future projects that were to result from this initial sort of groundwork setting project. Okay, so moving on to the second piece, and this is really trying to model the impact at scale. There are really 5 steps here that we roughly follow. As you'll kind of see in our case studies that we'll go through later today, some of these steps kind of get combined in the process, but when we're starting out and trying to think through how we're going to go from a project scope to one where we're actually coming up with a number and using it for assessment, we generally try to walk through these steps. So the first step is really figuring out what the scope of the project is and establishing what that carbon reduction pathway is. So both at the project level and at scale. And what that generally looks like for us anyways at TAF is, okay, trying to figure out what are the actions that this project is helping to support that would actually result in greenhouse gas emissions reductions. And then, okay, if this project was to scale to the rest of the Greater Toronto and Hamilton area, which is our geographic boundary, what does that reasonably look like? And that sort of informs the path we take through the rest of the assessment process. We also define out at the outset what scope emissions we will be including in the analysis. Typically, this just boils down to whether or not we're going to be including scope 3 emissions. So very quickly, scope 1 emissions typically includes any emissions that are controlled by the organization or within the project that's being analyzed. Within that boundary, scope 2 emissions are related to electricity usage, and scope 3 emissions are sort of impacts on emissions that occur upstream or downstream of the project being analyzed, but in many cases could be fairly significant. And historically, we've always really looked at scope 1 and scope 2 emissions, probably because scope 3 emissions are relatively hard to quantify, but we are looking at that more and more. And then, of course, defining what the boundary of this analysis is going to look like. As I mentioned, we at TAF will generally use the Greater Toronto and Hamilton area as our geographic boundary. And then there are other things that we might consider. So, for example, if we're looking at a retrofit project, we might only consider a specific segment of all retrofits, given the organization that's sort of leading the project or the specific project that's been defined in the proposal. Okay, so data collection. So the next step really is trying to figure out how we can quantify what is currently happening in that project area. So you might have heard this referred to as activity data. So if we're looking at things like trying to replace a transit fleet, we generally want to know how many vehicles make up that fleet, how many kilometers are being traveled by that fleet, so that we can understand, okay, if we were to replace that fleet with a zero emitting alternative, how many emissions are we generally displacing here? And this data can come from a number of sources. We do get much of our data from the applicant, and of course, we'll try to verify or at least ground that data in our own sort of third-party sources. There are also a number of local, national, international data sets and reports that we rely on to understand the potential scale of certain projects. So for example, the census data produced by the federal government on a every 5-year basis tends to be our source of truth for how many buildings might be available to us to actually retrofit, if that's a project we're looking at. But there are also other sources of data that come from the City of Toronto that if there are other jurisdictions that have done similar projects in the past, we typically look to them for other examples. We generally use whatever's at our disposal to really ground our assumptions and our data in third-party information. We also rely on our own inventories and our previous assessments. We've done a number of we've put a bunch of work into developing robust regional inventories as well as methodologies, and there's going to be a link to this later in the slide deck, but we have taken a crack at trying to estimate the marginal emissions factors associated with electricity consumption. We do rely on that work. We rely on work we've published, but also analysis we've done as part of previous assessments to help inform our future assessments. And then finally, there's a bunch of literature, both scholarly literature that's been published by academia and other groups, as well as great literature that's generally available on the web that we heavily rely on.
Akash, sorry to interrupt, but I'm just going to elevate these questions from Steve. He's wondering if we refer also to SSG's analysis from the Transform TO scenarios that they prepared on performance and penetration rate.
We do. So for the City of Toronto, especially, there's been a bunch of work as part of the Transform TO report and continued program, and so a lot of that modeling does form the foundation for a number of our assumptions when it comes to potential scale-up opportunities, et cetera. Thanks for the question. Was there anything else, Mary, or?
No, just that one question.
Okay.
Yeah.
Maybe that's a good point, actually. Maybe I'll just pause there. Was there anything else that anyone else wanted to ask at this point? I know this is very high level, and it's probably, it would probably be easier to picture once we're referring to specific sources when we dive into the case studies. But essentially the point I'm trying to get across here is that both that we rely on previous work that we've done relatively heavily, but also we basically look everywhere to ground our assumptions and our scale-up pathways in reports and data sets that other people have produced as much as possible, partly because there are a lot of assumptions we need to make as part of these exercises, but also to lend some sort of credibility to the work we do. Okay, I'll keep it moving then. Yeah, so essentially, after we've kind of gone through the exercise of identifying what data might be relevant to the initiative we're trying to analyze and really understanding what's out there, we then establish both what the baseline scenario would look like in the absence of this project, in the absence of this reduction pathway being realized, and an alternative scenario in which this initiative is approved and funded and completed, and it serves as a catalyst for this potential pathway being realized. As you can imagine, this is not, and this is something I'm going to dive into a bit deeper in a couple of slides, but this is not a straightforward exercise because you're, number one, being able to predict the future and understand and really come to a baseline scenario that would happen given the number of uncertainties that are associated with policy, with other projects being approved, et cetera. It's really us just trying to figure out what are reasonable assumptions to make, and relying on both stated federal and provincial policy in many cases to figure out what that future might look like. But what's even in some cases harder to do is, and this has sort of been pointed out by a couple of you, understanding how or kind of predicting how this initiative might actually scale to the rest of the GTHA if it was fully implemented. If a number of things went correctly, what are some reasonable things to expect to really understand what the actual potential of this initiative is at full realization. So a lot of it is us just making assumptions based on professional judgment on what adoption rates might look like, what those actual reductions in terms of electricity, what the future of the electricity grid might look like to assess things like fuel switching. There are a number of things that are uncertain about the future, and those feed into our inputs. But what we do is we try to be consistent in the way we apply those assumptions and those inputs across a number of different projects. And what we're hoping to do is, as part of this group, and then the number of people that are about to start doing this in many different parts of the country, we're hoping to establish some sort of consistency in how we apply those assumptions moving forward as well across all the centers. Now, this baseline versus scenario analysis is not something we've come up with. It's fairly common to most GHG quantification standards. Typically, we think about it in two different ways. So from an inventory accounting standpoint, what we're doing is we're measuring over time the actual GHG reductions from one year to the next to see what the impacts have been of these various initiatives that we've taken on as a city, as a province, as a country. But that's very different than when we're trying to predict what the estimated GHG impacts are going to be as a result of an initiative that we're supporting. And as I kind of mentioned, we're basically looking at a baseline scenario, comparing it to what the scenario would be if a certain initiative or policy was adopted, and then looking at the difference between those two. And so effectively what we're trying to do here is we know what the current emissions look like from a specific sector, from a specific, for a specific building. It could be at either a very project level, or it could be for an individual sector over a geographic area. We estimate what the baseline will look like if this initiative did not move forward. We then try to model what that scenario would look like if that project was implemented and then scaled to the rest of the geographic area, in our case, the GTHA. And then we take the area between these two lines and sum them up, and that's essentially our 20-year GHG impact for that potential pathway. And as I mentioned before, that's sort of the cumulative impact, and then we also will typically apply some sort of discount rate to value the near-term reductions more heavily. So part D is really taking that baseline versus scenario and extrapolating it to estimate the impact at scale. Generally, what you do at the project level, the sort of process you follow, the assumptions you make, can be extrapolated and applied to the entire region as well. And what we generally do at TAF is do an initial assessment of the project at first, and then sort of extrapolate it to the entire region using the same set of assumptions and inputs. We're relatively heavily reliant on the use of S-curves to estimate what that adoption might look like at scale. Sometimes we have other information that we can use if there are certain policies in place, or the proponent has propose some sort of timeline for the work to move forward. We can sometimes incorporate that, but in many cases we are using S-curves, which are very common in the innovation space, to estimate what that scale up might look like. And as some of you might be aware, this is something that's applied to or has been proven to be the case for a number of inventions across history. This is not anything new. We're not breaking new ground here, but we generally have taken what's used in sort of assessing the potential impact of an invention or new technology at scale, and applying it to our ability to scale up a specific carbon reduction initiative, and applying it to the entire geographic region over the next 20 years. So finally, after we've done that, we do move forward with some sort of internal QC and review. These generally fall into two different buckets. So we will try to find third-party sources of information to compare against. So generally, if there are independent assessments of what are the reduction potential, what is the reduction potential associated with a specific sector, like the transportation sector or the building sector, that's a decent enough baseline for us to anchor our assessment against. So if we think that this project is making a very small chunk in the transportation sector, but the assessment finds that we're going to reduce 80% of all transportation emissions that we've currently recorded in our inventory, we know that something's probably incorrect with either inputs, assumptions, or just generally the way we modeled the initiative. One thing that I've found really useful in the past is before actually starting any quantification work, write down what you think the impact of this initiative would be at scale. Go through your quantification process and then compare the two numbers afterwards. Sometimes you might surprise yourself, and there might be legitimate reasons why, but it's a good way to just make sure that you're not being biased by the work that you've carried out on your way to that final assessment. And then we also do a number of things internally as well. We do, for most grant projects and impact investing decisions, do some sort of peer review that can either be some sort of presentation or walkthrough internally, or at times we'll hand over that spreadsheet model to someone else and have them take a look at it with fresh eyes and point out challenges or flaws in the model that we might refine as part of this process. I'm going to stop there. Any questions up until now?
There's nothing on the chat right now, so happy to just open it up. Mark, yes.
Hey, I have never worked with an S-curve before, but I'm curious if you can share any information about how you actually decide the particular shape of that curve, like where the midpoint of the curve should be, or like the slope at the midpoint.
Yeah, I'm going to walk through a couple of examples shortly, but to answer your question, my understanding is that it is fairly judgment based. We do look at things like if there's third-party information that suggests that the timescale to implementation is 30 or 40 years, we might rely on that. Generally, the midpoint of that S-curve is at the midpoint of the timescale, so you generally have a ramp-up period. If we go back to this curve, generally, for most initiatives, that midpoint occurs at that midpoint of adoption occurs at the midpoint of that timescale, and that's generally something we rely on for most of our assessments. But in terms of how extreme that curve shape is, or how far out we extend that curve, part of it is judgment based, and part of it is whether or not we can find a third party or a previous assessment that's been done
Right.
that speaks to that timescale.
Okay, thanks. So would you typically be looking at like, well, the S-curve is going to happen with or without our grant funding. If we provide the funding, it's going to happen sooner. Like we're going to accelerate the ramp up of that curve and be looking at kind of like the difference in adoption between two curves over some period of time that you're analyzing?
Generally,
thinking
no,
about it the right way?
that's not how we've applied it. What we've tried to do is compare the baseline in the absence of that initiative being funded. If there's already work in the space that's being done, then I believe we assume some sort of scale up, and I can't recall whether or not we've used sort of different S-curves to compare the two.
Okay.
Usually, I believe the baseline doesn't rely on the S-curve. I think this is probably something I should get back to you on, because Marion would be able to speak to this in a lot more detail.
Fair enough.
But
yeah, I'll reach out if and when we actually find the need to do it. So
yeah,
thank you.
But I'll walk through an example shortly as well.
Akash, I'm just piping up here. I'm conscious of the time, and I wondered if maybe we could go directly to examples at this stage to just make sure we have ample time for that.
Yeah. Okay. So give me a second. All right, can everyone see my screen?
Yep, we can see it. The spreadsheet.
Sorry, just wanted verbal confirmation that everyone can see my screen.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, can you hear me? Yes, we can see it.
Yeah, we can see it, Akash.
Yeah. Can you hear us, Akash, or?
Oscar, I can see you talking, but I can't. I'm going to Zoom unless anyone types in the chat right now that everyone can see my screen. So I'll just start walking through this. If you can't hear me, just let me know. Okay, so I'm just going to walk through a couple of examples. These are simplified examples to make it easy to walk through for a presentation, but I'll just stay at the front that in many cases, many of these assessments have a bit more complexity associated with it, but I'm hoping we can just kind of walk through a simple example and use that to address any questions that any of you might have. So this example, the first one I'm going to walk through here, is the electrification of a municipality called Centerville. They're public transit accessible buses. And what we're doing here is we're taking this project and assuming that the pathway here would be the electrification of all accessible transit buses in the GTHA. So effectively what we're doing here is we're taking a look at, well, number one, we're trying to figure out what the total number of accessible buses are in the GTHA. That would be our sort of anchor. And then we will then be comparing the reductions, or sorry, the GHG emissions that would have resulted from the combustion of propane to that of emissions from the electricity grid, given that those buses are being converted. So the first step is really grounding our analysis in some data. So effectively what we've done here is we have the population of the GTHA, which is 7.28 million. We have a population of the city called Centerville at 1.5 million. We know that Centerville has 100 accessible vehicles in their transit fleet, and we're just assuming a proportional increase based on that data that's provided by the proponent, and assuming that as a result, there are 485 accessible vehicles that we would be replacing in the GTHA if this were to scale to 100%. We also have some information on the average distance traveled by some of these vehicles. This is from the proponent report, and we're assuming it to be the same for all vehicles in the GTHA, which may or may not be true. We know what the fuel efficiency of both the electric bus and the propane bus are. And we also know what the emissions factor of propane is given the reporting requirements supplied by the supplied by Environment Canada. So these are all of our inputs. Some of it is data that we're sourcing from other places, assumptions we're making, as well as a number of the emissions factors that will drive our analysis. So we then try to model this. We know that the number of accessible buses in the GTHA is approximately 485 based on that extrapolation estimate. We do have an assumption for population growth based on past data, and we use that to scale the number of accessible buses that exist in all of the fleets in the GTHA. We also have marginal emissions factors for electricity based on our own internal analysis. And then we're also making some assumptions on fuel improvements to propane buses over time. So we're essentially assuming a 0.25% increase on the fuel efficiency of those buses over the next 20 years. So I'll jump back to this in a sec, but essentially what we're trying to do is we're trying to figure out, okay, we're funding this project. If this were to scale to the rest of the GTHA, what is sort of the potential here? And as I mentioned, in many cases, we rely on something called the S-curve. This is sort of a standard formulation where there's a formula here, but essentially we can change the formula or the shape of this S-curve by playing around with some of these parameters. This time horizon here, which was a question that was asked, generally depicts how long we expect that time scale to be till sort of full adoption. And we can go over I'm happy to discuss the S-curve at length at some other point, but I think what's of more interest to everyone here is what we expect to happen. So we are assuming that under a business as usual scenario that the capped adoption rate would be 10%. This is largely sourced from sort of an independent study talking about light and medium heavy duty vehicles and what the expected adoption rates of electric vehicles would be under a baseline scenario. And we are assuming that if we were to fund this initiative and everything were to go right, that we might see an adoption rate of up to 50% for transit accessible vehicles in the next 20 years. And we then use an S-curve to estimate, based on a 20-year timescale, what that might look like. Now, the shape of these curves can be different for both. We've sort of simplified it for this example, but effectively what we're doing here is we're saying, okay, we're going to move the adoption of these vehicles for all transit accessible vehicles in the GTHA from sort of this rate to this rate over the next 20 years. And effectively what we end up doing is we then estimate the total emissions resulting from these vehicle fleets, both under the business as usual case as well as the scenario. And so this is sort of modeled here. I'm not going to dive into the individual numbers, but effectively what we're trying to get to is the total reductions that would take place in every year for the next 20 years, given this sort of envisioned full out scale up of accessible buses. And we end up at a number of 27,000 tons of CO2e emissions reduced over 20 years, and that results in a net present value of just over 13.5 thousand tons over 20 years. And as you can imagine, that's not a lot. That would be well below our threshold. So something we might do at this point is we might go back to the proponent and ask them, okay, well, currently the scope of your project is largely limited to accessible buses. Is there a way we could tweak that to maybe look at your entire transit fleet? Is this something you're planning on doing? Is this something that we can use to justify this being a catalyst for that future investment in all of your in your entire transit fleet? And is that something we can reasonably apply to the rest of the GTHA? We traditionally or typically do try to document a number of our assumptions. There are other complexities that might be associated with a model like this. For example, transit fleets might not be made up of just propane vehicles. There might be a mix. There might be differences between jurisdictions in terms of how many kilometers each of those vehicles might be traveling, whether or not accessible transit vehicles might have a higher concentration rate in certain jurisdictions than others. But effectively what we're trying to do here is make some simplifying assumptions, try to get a sense of what the actual scale pathway here is and what the cumulative reductions would be at scale, and then use that to make a broad assessment of, is this worth investing in? And if there's further discussion that is needed with the proponent in order to refine this further, we would do that at this point as well. I know that we have just a few minutes left. I think what I'll do is I'll pause for questions there just so that this is still fresh in mind, but I'm happy to walk through another example as well. I ran through that pretty quickly, but I'm happy to share these spreadsheets as well after the fact.
Steve, do you want to maybe talk about your comment in the chat?
It's my normal comment, but Akash, thanks so much and for all this work that we get to build upon. It's just my comment that you know.
Sorry, Steve. I've suddenly lost all sound, and I'm not sure if that's just me.
Oscar, do you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you, Steve. I think it's Akash.
Tuning me out can be a good strategy sometimes.
Okay, I can hear you now.
There you go.
So basically, just the idea that they're often two very important assumptions, and the penetration. And so it's important not to lose sight of that. And you know, so here, like that 50% sort of penetration rate. And I think for the LC3 centers, if there's a way we can sort of build upon some of the detailed work you all did to come up with reasonable numbers based on sort of best practices and all that, and then be able to play with some assumptions about performance or penetration scenarios, that'd be really helpful to be able to sort of come up with some rough numbers.
Yeah, no, I think that's a valid point, and one of the things I'm hoping we can do, and it's in one of the slides that I don't think I'm going to have a chance to go through, is to develop a bit of a community of practice, right? So as you can imagine, that penetration rate is largely, in many cases, judgment based, and so it really comes down to how conservative or optimistic you are with those assumptions. And so I think if we can establish at least some sort of range across jurisdictions or across centers that we're commonly applying, that would be a good outcome to strive for.
Yeah, or even as we spoke, if we have a low, medium, high, and I thought it was medium, and Marie-Claude thought it was high, and Mike thought it was low, great. Then let's measure, so you sort of see how it evolves. But to not forget that, yeah, there's going to be judgment on some really big assumptions. That's fine, but we can get lost sometimes in second, third decimal point about which factors are drive the numbers the most.
Yeah, and I think one other thing I just want to point out is we do sensitivity testing on some of this stuff, largely to just see, okay. I mean, for us, really, in our experience, because we're not so much concerned with that exact number, but generally whether or not this is something that's substantial or not, modifying that number by a few percent here or there doesn't really usually impact the final decision. But we do often play around with those numbers to understand what are we actually looking at in terms of a range of a final quantification assessment.
I think we have Mike as well.
Yeah, I don't know if you can hear me or not. Hopefully you can. Yep. So yeah, and I get that. Like, actually, for decision making, this is interesting to me. For decision making, it is kind of interesting. You can kind of contextualize, okay, where am I trying to, I guess, direct my dollars so that I can hope and prayer that I'm getting a certain amount of impact out of these dollars. Because there's a whole bunch of things, not just in penetration rate, but there's a whole bunch of other things that could happen in a lot of these that you need to think of as assumptions as well. Like this one, not quite the same as a lot of the projects we're doing, but often there's 5, 6, 7 other barriers that need to be removed in addition to the one that we're actually funding. So there's an assumption that you're going to be able to remove all of those in a logical, sequential fashion over the period so that you do get that penetration rate. So that's one thing that consistency is going to be tough to achieve. And for decision making, yeah, I think that's okay. But the challenge I think we have as a network is that we report this too. And we report and we aggregate this and we report this through FCM. And even I just actually presented a GMF council, and I'm not sure if Kate's on the call or not, but that was one of the things that we talked about was like how much impact are your grants creating? And so it's being perceived like it's reporting our impact when it's actually a decision-making tool. And so I do worry about that. So I'm not sure if it's clear that is how we're utilizing this. And I could be wrong. Maybe that clarity is behind the scenes, but certainly I didn't get the impression that it was. But decision making, I think this is an interesting sort of scenario approach, like similar to what you would do, like an SSG would do in a sensitivity analysis of the 25, 26 actions you can undertake to achieve carbon neutrality by 2050. That's interesting, but yeah, I just don't think it actually is reporting our impact.
Yeah, I think there's definitely something to that, and probably worth having a separate discussion on. I mean, I agree in general that like one of the things I'm conscious of is when we're coming up with that potential number, as you said, we're kind of assuming that everything's going to go right, that we're going to be able to remove all those barriers, but we're not really reflecting in that final quantification number how many of those barriers actually exist. How likely is it for that initiative to actually scale? Because there might be something that's much closer to that vision than another. So I think this is probably worth having a separate discussion on, but I definitely get your overall point.
So it seems, well, no, just checking on times, it seems like there's certainly a number of items that, we'll have to be following up on. I know there's a couple of questions, Akash, that you will probably have to check on your end with Miriam and whatnot. But both from your perspective and Mary's perspective, just wanted to check in terms of next steps, as well as any materials that I can share following this presentation. It'd be great to know, as I'm sure some of the people are certainly curious and looking forward to digging into some of those materials.
Yeah, so what I'm going to do is maybe Oscar, I can work through you to circulate some materials. I'll definitely send you the 2 case studies, the one that I just showed here today and then the one that I didn't get to. It might not be today because I wanted to get Miriam's eyes on it before I sent it out, just to make sure that we're not distributing something that might be an incorrect reflection of her other assessments. But I'll do that shortly. And I think the one thing I want to bring up here was the sort of idea of a community of practice, but I think that can probably be a follow-up discussion. So how do we start with that? How do we, what sort of cadence do we use, and who should be at the table for that? So, but maybe that's a separate email or discussion.
I'll just wade in too, just to finish up. Thanks so much, Akash. I just wanted to, I know that it's been a bit of a difficult situation. You've only been here for a few months. We didn't have access to our, to Miriam today, but we will certainly, this is an ongoing discussion. And I think, what really helps is the examples here. There's a lot of stuff to get through, and this is why this is the 101. But I think looking at more examples, and all of you have an opportunity to go through some example cases, as Mike has done already, from your own situation. So that I think that's the best possible learning. Like, you just, let's give it a whirl. We get down, we look at a few things together, see how these things work on the ground. So that's an opportunity for all of you to take advantage of with Akash and Miriam as we go forward. And also there's a couple of questions coming out of here. It's great. I'm going to try and answer those for you. And I think especially this issue, Mike, that you're bringing up is this a performance metric? How do we use it as a performance metric? We've discussed this before. It's more of a decision-making metric. How do we translate this into something meaningful for reporting? And I think ultimately that's a time issue, because we have to look at impacts after the fact. So that has to do with our post hoc assessments. But in the meantime, I think we need to come together with some very careful communication, being very careful about how we use these numbers so people don't draw the wrong conclusions from them. So in many ways, there's an important communications element here as we convey the kind of numbers we're using as decision-making tools in this metric. So I'll leave it there. And I think we really look forward to, and as Akash said, to having some colleagues, to poke at this thing, to strengthen it, and in an ongoing way. So we'll just phase 1, look forward to more work together.
Well, thank you so much, Akash, for your presentation today. I will certainly follow up with you for any of the materials and things to follow up with the group. And if any of the people that attended the session have any questions, can I just redirect those to you that may come up with additional questions afterwards?
Yeah, definitely.
Yep,
and
okay.
if there's anything that comes up afterwards, or if you want to just shoot me an email, I'm happy to either answer it myself or get the answer for you.
Fantastic. Okay. Well, thank you everyone for joining us this afternoon. We'll make sure to also share the link to the recording for those who couldn't attend, and look forward to future conversations on the community of practice. So have a good rest of your afternoon.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Thanks, Oscar.
Bye,
Thanks, everyone.